Good morning. So nothing is not punctual. It's the Edgar P. Richardson Symposium. I want to welcome everyone. It's 10:30, and we have an incredible amount of panels today. So I encourage you to make plans to stay. The symposium will wrap up at 6 with Taina making closing remarks. And I'm Kate LeMay. I'm a historian at the National Portrait Gallery, and I am the co-curator with Taina Carrigal of 1898 U.S. Imperial Visions and Revisions. This is the Edgar P. Richardson Symposium. It's part of Portal, the scholarly center of the National Portrait Gallery, which hosts a number of programs, including an essay prize that's biannual, the Richardson Symposium, which is biannual, writing workshop for scholars writing on biography, portraiture, and art. What else do we do? Lectures, invited lectures. I'm just like ad hoc right now. We have a really wonderful series, the Tommy Pegas and Donald Capocha lecture series on LGBTQ plus portraiture and identity. And we also have a series, the Greenberg-Steinhauser series in American portraiture, which hosts study days, and that is when art historians, et cetera, are invited in for a private day of study in a gallery. So we're very proud of the work that Portal does at the National Portrait Gallery. It's housed within the history department, and this is just one of the many programs that we do. So without further ado, I would like to invite David Silbey up to kick us off with our military history and 1898 panel. Thank you.
Many years ago, when I came up onto the stage for something, I caught my foot on one of the stairs and threw my paper up in the air, and I had not numbered the pages. So to say that presentation was somewhat disjointed is a slight understatement. Welcome to the Military History in 1898 panel. I'm David Silbey. I'm a historian at Cornell University, and I'm very glad to be here. I wanted to add my thanks to the organizers of both the symposium and the curators of the quite remarkable exhibit upstairs. It is a splendid, splendid achievement, and something quite unimaginable even, I think, 10 years ago. I want to chat for a little bit about how I see some of this panel, and then I very much want to hand it over to the presenters, give them plenty of time to talk, and then ask some questions after the papers are done. I'll note that the era of 1898 is shaped in many ways, mostly bad, by wars, violence, militaries, and by martial culture. We are here focusing on a particular conflict, but wars in this period span the hemisphere, span the globe. Nations, prospective nations, and cultures define themselves by their success or failure on the battlefield. In the United States, as the Civil War generation aged, a wave of memorialization of the battles and leaders of that war was used as a cudgel to impose a stifling and violent system of racial oppression, a fight that is still ongoing in the United States to this day. The steamships of the revitalized U.S. Navy were seen as evidence of America's progress and modernity. The destruction of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor created such public outrage, not just, I think, because of the loss of life, but because it seemed to undercut that sense of modernity, that sense of progress. It was also, as others have noted, both in this symposium and elsewhere, the moment when the United States decided to become a global power. Before 1898, almost every American war had been fought in North America, quote unquote, at home. as the Americans like to think of it. After 1898, almost all American wars were abroad. Arthur MacArthur, when he was given command in the Dakotas, settled his family, a general in the U.S. Army, settled his family in Minneapolis and commuted to work on the train out to his command post. 10 years later, when he was sent to the Philippines, he was 9,000 miles away in a area and nation that he found strange and uncivilized, as he put it. War for the United States went from being a local occupation to being something that happened elsewhere, far away. That is also true, still true to this day. In that process of leaving the home for the abroad, the U.S. Began or continued, I would suggest, to encounter other nations and other communities, and those communities and nations encountered the United States. Or rather, let me suggest that the U.S. encountered other nations and communities as they perceived them to be, rather than as they really were. We've heard yesterday about the ranges of the ways in which Americans imposed their perceptions on Cubans and Filipinos and a whole range of other foreign populations. Americans abroad did not have to learn about the cultures they were coming into, that they were conquering, because they had already decided on the characteristics of those cultures. The most famous example, of course, is Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden, half devil and half child. Everybody was the same person in this, based less on reality than on American beliefs and cultures. And I note, when I worked on the Philippine-American War, and as Katharine Bjork has shown, the language that the Americans used about the Filipinos was the same language they used about the indigenous populations of the American West. They translated that language directly without bothering to figure out whether it applied. In a sense, victory in war, victory in conquest, victory in imperialism gave the United States the impetus to not only rule the conquered, but to impose their identities and histories upon those conquered. And it's notable that all of the places that we are encountering at this symposium, even before this era, have spent most of their history with their history being given to them. That their history was defined for them by someone else in places as far apart as Cuba and the Philippines. My hope today is that this panel will explore and recover some of that history, suggest further avenues of exploration, and introduce us to some of the people, places, and things that we have not yet seen. With all of that said, let me introduce the panelists briefly and then hand it over to them. I'll be back to ask probing, or what I think of as probing, questions afterwards. We'll see if I can live up to that. But first, José Bolívar is a historian who specializes in 20th century Puerto Rican history. He has a PhD from the University of Puerto Rico and has published numerous books and articles on Puerto Rican history in both Spanish and English. Katharine Bjork is professor of history at Hamline University. She's the author of Prairie Imperialists, the Indian Country Origins of American Empire, and has a PhD from the University of Chicago. Jason Smith is associate professor of history at Southern Connecticut State University and has written to Master the Boundless Sea, the U.S. Navy, the Marine Environment, and the Cartography of Empire. His PhD is from Temple University. I still like him despite that. Ryan Wadle is associate professor in the John B. Hattendorf Center for Maritime Historical Research at the U.S. Naval War College and the author of Selling Sea Power, Public Relations, and the U.S. Navy, 1917 to 1941. His PhD is from Texas A&M. Please join me in welcoming all the panelists. And I'll note, as we begin, I'll repeat what Dr. Hoganson said yesterday. Some of the images and words you're going to see in the presentations today are racist and sexist in the way that the history of the 19th and 20th century was. To explore that history, we sometimes have to deal with stuff that is patently offensive, but I wanted to highlight it for you so you had a sense beforehand. Thank you very much.
Well, David, I made it up the stairs without falling down. I do want to take a few seconds of my 15 minutes to thank Kate LeMay, Clara De Pablo, and Taina Caracol. They did an amazing job, and I think that should be congratulated. And I hope you continue. I hope to see you soon in another forum like this. Well, I'm going to try to compact 10 years of research into 15 minutes, so I'll try to do my best. So I'm going to present some of the highlights of my forthcoming book titled Founder of La República, Federico Pérez Carbó and His Fight for Cuban Independence. And I don't know, how do you do this thing? Cool. Oh, it works. Oh, how nice. I'm not really good at this stuff. Okay, so I guess most people have not heard of Federico Pérez Carbó. I was talking to Ada Ferrer yesterday, and she did know who he was. So apparently there are some Cuban historians that know about him, but most people do not. He is, I call him, it's a biography. This book is a biography of a common man, but yet a very accomplished individual. Federico Pérez Carbó does not figure among the great generals. We talked about Antonio Maceo. He's upstairs someplace. I mean, his picture's upstairs. He's not there. And you know, we talk about these people, and Federico Pérez Carbó is nowhere to be seen. He is unknown, yet precisely because of this secondary condition lies the interest in this particular study. And one of the exceptional qualities of Federico, he was both a soldier and a journalist. And I'll repeat what Ada said yesterday. He fought in all the wars, and one of them was a 10-year war, 68, 78. He also fought in the Small War, 79, 80, and in the War of Independence from 95 to 98. So as you can see, he's a very busy kind of guy. But in addition to that, he was a spy, he was exiled, he was jailed, he was wounded, and he was a filibuster. And he had time to get married. So again, very busy guy. So I'll begin to give you a glimpse of some of the information that I was able to obtain. And in this case, it was somewhat difficult because the research required data points or documents from Spain, from San Juan, from Santiago de Cuba, from La Habana, from Miami, and from National Archives. So it was a tough sell. That's why it took us so long to complete this book. But I wanted to put this one in particular. These were some documents or some letters that Federico wrote. He wrote to his wife, his newly minted wife, and other friends. And he donated them to Archivo Nacional de La Habana. Now, the important thing about this is he knew his importance, historical importance, so he kept those documents. Now, as I read those documents, there were over 300 letters, I found out they were written by Federico and they went to these other people. But there was no answers. You know, I would imagine that his wife would answer the letters. So as I did the research, I found out the reason why. And the reason why was that, you know, his wife was in Santiago while Federico was gallivanting during these wars. And the Spanish figured that they might want to pay a visit to Antonia, his wife. And she figured that all these letters that she wrote to Federico was probably not a good idea, so she burnt them. So I think it's important that data is important because it tells you that history is incomplete, history is lost, and you've got to sort of make up for those points that are lost. Okay. Again, Federico was into documenting his time. So he wrote diary or a memoir, but and then I'll point this out. The diary was written about 1940s. Federico was in his 80s, which basically means that even in his 80s he can still write. So it gives you a really good idea of what he did. He was very thorough, and he talked about going to the archives to make sure that the memoir was not only his memories, but also the archives. He lived in Santiago, so it was pretty easy. I mean, he was just had to walk a block, and that was over the archives. But he did take the time to do it that way. Now, I want to compare that to this. Okay, got it. This is his diary. Now, I'll go into this in more detail later on. But the diary goes from 1879 to 1882. And it's a detailed diary of the time that he was jailed and that he was exiled to Spain. And then I'll go through the details. But the important thing about this is that it was written in this particular time period. So you notice, or I noticed when I read this, that when he was writing the diary, he was not a particularly happy camper because he was in jail. Food was not the greatest, and he wasn't where he wanted to be. Whereas when he wrote in his 80s, things were a little different. He was writing also for niceties. So he basically joked about a lot of things that in his diary he does not joke. Now, the other thing that to me was very interesting is that I have two diaries, or we use two diaries. One was from Federico Pérez Carbó, but the other one was from Emilio Bacardi, and you'll find out why. But the interesting thing about this is they were both jailed and exiled at the same time. So you have two different persons looking at the same events from different points of view. So I thought that was interesting. And then, of course, he also wrote in Acción Ciudadana. Again, these were, I'm highlighting these documents, among others, because he was just difficult to obtain. They're from Santiago de Cuba and from Havana, and it was difficult to get a hold of them, at least for me. So, it was very important that I had these documents, because these were primary documents that Federico actually written. Again, he wrote these in 1940s. He was in his 80s, so you get a different perspective, but you do get the storyline. And I wanted to show you who Federico was. This is his carnet, his ID from the Ejército Libertador, the Liberation Army. It's dated from 1919, so he's 64. He doesn't look too bad for 64, considering the time he was at war wounded. But to me, one of the interesting things that I was reading his letters was that he was complaining to the government that he was not paid on time. So I guess maybe things have not changed that much. Okay, I am sure anybody that's done Cuban history has seen this picture before. And whoever has not seen it, I'll just describe it very briefly. This was the Confederate ship, former Confederate ship Virginius. So this was 1873. It was captured by Spain, and as you can see, it's not having a good time there. The U.S. thought about going to war with Spain at the time, but President Grant figured that the Civil War had ended in 1865. That was 8 years ago. The U.S. was not in a position to go to war, so they sort of looked the other way. But the interesting thing was not that. You can read that in most history books or in Wikipedia. I think the interesting thing from my perspective was that El Matadero, or the slaughterhouse, was right next to the Bacardi Rum Company. And Emilio Bacardi and Facundo Bacardi were working at the Bacardi Rum plant, and they saw this spectacle, and that it made them change their mind about the relationship with Spain. For them, La República de Cuba would be unconditional. There would be no negotiation based on what they saw. There were other points that they saw and other information, but this was critical to their decision. And as a matter of fact, anybody that drinks Bacardi, I'm sure that you don't, but if you do drink Bacardi, at some point in time, you might see a bottle of Bacardi that says Bacardi 1873, 1873, and that commemorates this event. As I was looking at the documents for Federico, I thought one of the interesting things is he goes back and forth in time. So after the war, he was into preserving these historical monuments. El Matadero was going to be demolished, and he made sure that part of it was remembered, and there was a plaque. I haven't been to Santiago, but all the documents that I know, and I'm sure it's there, that it was preserved, because for the Cubans, preserving history, at least for Federico, was extremely important. Okay, this is a copy of the picture that you saw upstairs, if you saw it. They did a presentation on it. This is not the original, by the way, but it is a copy. And the reason I put it up there is because in the middle, there's Antonio Maceo, and on the left, there's Flor Crombit. Now, the reason I put them up there is because Federico befriended both of them. They were important elements in the decisions that he took in his life, and vice versa. At the beginning of the 10-year war, Federico spied for Crombit in his role as a city hall. And during the War of Independence, Federico was the chief of staff of Antonio Maceo. So there was a close collaboration among both of them, and there was a friendship, a close friendship. Okay, so this is the city hall. This is where Federico set up. Just to give you an idea, Federico is about 20 years old, 18, 20, 21. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact date, but he was a young guy, and he set up a spy network here at City Hall. He was working with the Spanish, but he could hear, people drinking and people talking, and he made sure that information went back to Cromwell in La Sierra, or in the mountains. So it was a lot of critical information on Spanish strategies. Some of the information was not accurate, but a lot of it was. So it's very useful information for Cromwell. And that's when the relationship between Federico and Cromwell started to go up. But here's the thing. As things happen, things don't always happen the way you want to. He was betrayed actually by one of his collaborators, and he had to flee. And there's a lot of information and interesting information on how he fled to the Sierra to be with Cromwell. And also, there was a warrant for his arrest, so he had to leave, unless he wanted to go to jail. Now, his father was not very pleased with the situation, and his father was a comerciante in Santiago de Cuba. So he figured it was best if Federico basically left Santiago. It would be better for him. So he arranged for a trip to Federico, and he went to Colombia, and he stayed there for a while. At the end of the war, 78, there's a San Juan Pact. It was controversial. It was a ceasefire, and he comes back. But there's still a warrant for his arrest, so he had to be careful. So next year, the following year, is what they call the Guerra Chiquita, small war. It starts in 1879. So there was a warrant for his arrest. They pretty much knew about his activities. The Spanish figured, well, not a good idea to have Federico around. So they actually imprisoned Federico, and they imprisoned Emilio Bacardi, in the same city hall where he was working. So it gives us two different perspectives. One is he was free working, and now he's in jail. But the Spanish were not interested in having Federico or Emilio in jail. They wanted them out of the country. So they figured, well, why not send them to Spain? But it took a while. It wasn't like you could go on JetBlue or anything like that. So this is El Morro de Santiago de Cuba, and they went to El Morro, and all this is part of both the diary of Emilio and Federico. And the interesting thing about it is how they were treated. So when they were in El Morro, they were treated very nicely. The warden's wife gave them coffee. Federico was very pleased with the coffee. I think the warden's wife also danced something. He didn't say what they were dancing, but Federico wrote him a poem. Again, I never saw the poem. I hope it's not X-rated, but he got the poem. So they were treated nicely. So after Santiago, they go to San Juan, Puerto Rico, because they had to pick up some other Cubans. Now, these were not the first Cubans that were exiled. There were others. But there was a ship that was going to go to La Península, to Spain, and they had to pick up some Cubans. And those Cubans were jailed in El San Cristobal. Now, San Cristobal in San Juan, Puerto Rico. This was new information for National Park Service. They did not know about this. And in the National Archives of Puerto Rico, there's a list of, let's see, there it is. is not the list, but it shows you the penmanship of the Spaniards. But it also shows you that they were very, very clear on who they were. Not only would they tell you the quantity, here it just says 40 cubanos. 1 minute. Oh my God, okay. 2 minutes, sorry. No, 1 minute. Oh, I didn't see you, okay. Well, like I said, it's 10 minutes of research and 15 minutes. I'll just really go, I'll just do part of it. But anyway, they went from San Juan into La Península to Spain, and they went on the Antonio Lopez. And again, this part of the diary, and what it basically it gives you a different perspective. They were treated very, very nicely at the beginning and very, very harsh at the end. There's, the food was not good, the sanitations were terrible, and I think, since I only have a minute, I'll just compress. If we all have PhDs, well, the Cubans basically, this is the PhD of the Cuban leadership. All these leaders, Federico, Emilio, Maceo, and Maceo's brothers, they all went to, the Antonio Lopez. They all went to islands of Chafarinas, which I would not recommend as a tourist attraction, but it's there. They had no water, and that's a commonality that they had, and that is why in the War of Independence there was no negotiation. It was Cuba Libre or nothing. That's it. Adios.
I see we missed some of José's presentation, but what we got was great. I'm going to, this is very suggestive. Okay, and here we are to me. I'm just delighted and very honored to be here. And as David Silbey said in the beginning, my work has to do with some continuities of empire. In U.S. historiography, 1898 is shorthand for the emergence of the United States as an empire. Various things: an empire, naval power, rival to European powers on the world stage. But the moment marks a juncture, a departure from the nation's expansion across the North American continent. I see a deeper history of the development of the United States as an empire, which began on this continent. And before I move on, just a quick reminder to us of the preeminence of the military. I think this has gone sort of, well, it's been assumed in the presentation so far, but it's good to mark this not only in the military operations, the occupations, but in significant aspects of civil military administration as well. So the broad continuity, or one of the major continuities that I want to highlight here, is that for the Army as an institution, and for a number of individual soldiers, American military personnel, their previous 3 decades of experience was in another context of the expansion of U.S. empire. That's the efforts to extend U.S. sovereignty in the Trans-Mississippi West. This is represented here by a lot of very active map, and you're not close enough to see exactly what the information conveyed there is, but basically it's a lot of fort building to try to constrain the movements of native nations, Lakota and Cheyenne in particular, on the Western Plains, and battles and massacres as well. This is also another way. This is based on the biographical work that historian Walter Williams did and published in 1980. That's a very often cited kind of measure of this continuity, right? The lived experience of a number of officers who ended up both commanding troops, pacification campaigns, and in, again, civil military positions in the Philippines. Okay, so what has this all got to do with scouting, and what is a scout anyway? Well, in the basic and general sense, a scout is somebody who, in a military context, performs reconnoitering, figuring things out. But it has, in my presentation and in the usage at this time, a racialized idea. So I'm talking about native auxiliaries to the U.S. Army here, and native auxiliaries, of course, were used by other colonial powers as well. I'm thinking particularly the British in South Africa in this same period. And I want to pause here for a moment because I think there's a way that we use this word native as an adjective today that is intended to recognize a claim of sovereignty. That is not what is going on with this word, most usually used as a noun. Natives are, as Silbey and others who have presented in this conference have highlighted, a particular type of people, people subject to colonization and very much located on a schema of civilization to barbarity, which is one of the valences that's operating here. I want to give another perspective, which is something that fascinates me very much about the sense of and the use and the mythos, really, in the American frontier military about the role of scout, which I think has continued into the 20th and even 21st century. So here is a little excerpt from a writing by Robert Lee Bullard, who fought in Apache Wars, and then it was a spy in Cuba in the provisional government period, 1906 to 1909, and also district commander in the Philippines, in Mindanao, and also in Batangas as well. He says about the figure of the scout, "No amount of learning or philosophy or civilization ever quite takes a man beyond a secret willingness, even longing, to be a trapper, ranger, hunter, woodcraftsman, or fighter of savages or outlaws, all in one word, scout. In this, the high and the low, civilized and savage, the general and the private soldier differ not. Emperors and kings, princes, leaders, teachers, the greatest that the world has held, have aspired to the qualities, the name, and reputation of scout. Is it, as some super-civilized these days would have us believe, the callback of the wild, the echo of savagery? Ah, no, but something better than they with all their reason can offer us, touch with nature." This scouting has a long tradition, and a part of it is referenced here with this print that was made in 1770s of a famous figure in this genealogy of frontier scouts, a European scout in this sense. This is Major Robert Rogers, who grew up on a New Hampshire farm in the mid-18th century, gained fame for himself and for his tactics of irregular warfare during the French and Indian Wars, based largely on techniques adapted from warfare with Indians in New England. And if you look at this image, you can see there in the background, metaphorically in the background, I think, these stylized Indians, one with a tomahawk, one with a knife, that provide the sort of sense of where this approach to warfare is coming from. Army officers needed scouts to serve as intermediaries between the military and Indians, both adversaries and allies. Some scouts were men whose hybrid European and indigenous ancestry gave them an advantage moving between cultures. Legendary figures such as Buffalo Bill Cody William Cody, who served as a scout with the Army as well. Notwithstanding, a majority of the scouts who fought with the Army in its Indian wars were other Indians. For the first 200 years of their involvement in the wars and frontier skirmishes of Anglo-Americans, Indians had remained outside the formal structure of the Army, but in the reorganization, the Army Reorganization Act of 1866, Indians are organized for the first time within the structure of the regular Army. This is the same legislation that organizes the segregated African American troops, including the 2 units of cavalry, which often get called the Buffalo Soldiers. And I do want to sort of recognize here, right, point out that the structure of the Army is reflecting a larger segregation of on racial basis, and also the constraint on the and reflected failure to recognize capacity for command, right? That's one of the very significant things here, right? There's not the ability to, there were white officers for these racially organized units within the Army. A couple of slides here of Indian scouts in this period, Pawnee scouts, very active, particularly in the so-called Sioux Wars in 1860s and 1870s, and a troop here of Oglala Lakota scouts in the aftermath of the Wounded Knee Massacre under the command of Lieutenant John J. Pershing, who goes on to advocate for the formation of ethnically based scouting units in the Philippines, and of course is military governor there in Moro province and district commander around Lake Lanao and so on throughout a lot of the period of this, of that counterinsurgency, as the Americans styled it. The last Indian Scout regiment, a troop rather, was dissolved in 1897. It was Troop L of the 7th Cavalry, Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache scouts on Fort Sill in Indian Territory, and that brings us up to the continuity then. I am, of course, trying to get in this presentation to the formation of ethnically and regionally recruited and organized scouts in the Philippines, but quick digression here to Cuba, and to say, first of all, no, there were no Indian scout troops that were sent to Cuba. There were, however, and I think this is interesting to mention here, a number of Native Americans, of Indians who enlisted. By this time, the Indian troops were disbanded, and enlistment was direct in the Army. So a number of Native soldiers who served, including William Pollock, shown here after his return at the quarantine camp in New York from Cuba, one of 8 Pawnee scouts who, hold on just a second. It's threatening to hide presentation here. That's, I think, what I don't want to do. Okay, there we go. And this, so on his enlistment papers, William Pollock listed his occupation as artist. And I understand that there is in this collection of this museum his painting, and I included this because it suggests this much broader kind of range of associations with scouting. Here, this is called Buffalo Bill, and it was William Pollock's intention to join Buffalo Bill's Wild West show after returning from Cuba. Unfortunately, he didn't do that. He lived only 6 months later. My death date for him is wrong here. He died actually 6 months into 1899 of pneumonia, and most likely from contracting malaria in Cuba. Okay, but Cuban scouts. This, it refers to this practice of relegating the Cuban supposed allies in the joint struggle against Spain, right, to the role as as laborers, and I think it makes us contemplate the subservient nature. There's a lot of mythos with the scout, but it's a very subservient role. Calixto Garcia complained, and other Cubans complained about Cubans being used and referred to as Calixto Garcia said, as pack mules, right? So I'm not going to have time here to unpack these two images, but basically they reflect, you know, in different registers of sort of fraternal heroism and more reality on the right, the landing and the conferences among commanding generals of the U.S. Army. There's Shafter, the Army general, and Sampson, the Navy admiral in this boat, and then General Calixto Garcia meeting with William Ludlow on the right. But the point is that rhetorical recruitment of Cubans to fill this kind of role. And the, it's not showing up here, but it's giving me another, sorry. Okay, so you can see here Theodore Roosevelt's estimation of the Cuban fighting capacity, which was very denigrated, right, and very dismissed. This is what he published in 1899. And this mention of this can be the Cuban role. Well, actually, they couldn't even do that. All right. But find this. Oh, okay. It is giving me. I've inadvertently hit something on here that stops me from it. Okay. Let's see. That should. Okay. All right. So Matthew Batson. Hurrying to the end here, famous as a commander of one of the regionally based scouting units, Macabebe Scouts, he was in Cuba, and in his job interview, essentially with Henry Lawton for this command post of the Macabebe Scouts, he cited his Cuban experience, supposedly, which could only have been a few days and wasn't in a formal capacity. There was no such detail formed, but he said, you know, this is, and he said this is all the experience he had. I mean, it wasn't that he was, well, he was kind of citing this as his previous experience. So I see the 1 minute sign there. So I need to finish up quickly, and of course, this is where I see this very suggested similarity, both in the first casual recruitment, some of that prefiguring, right, and casting Filipinos in this role, but then the very tactical, strategic kind of idea about organizing these units. And this one, the Macabebe Scout unit that was commanded by that Matthew Batson, eventually grew into 5 companies and are famous for participating in the capture of Emilio Aguinaldo in 1901. And last slide, totally inadequate to deal with this history, but similar to the progression of informal relationship to the Army, Philippine Scouts are organized as a regular unit within the Philippines, within the American Army, the U.S. Army, in 1901. First, with this emphasis on ethnic, linguistic, and for the Americans, you know, same kind of strategic idea of playing one group off another, and later as a major and very long-lasting separate unit within the U.S. Army structure of the Philippine Scouts, which lasts until 1946. So, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here with you all. What I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about some work that I've been doing on a second book project that really is looking at examining American culture in the ways in which ordinary Americans encounter the U.S. Navy, and also ideas like navalism, sea power, and of course empire between 1890 and 1916, with of course 1898 being a critical year. But one of the moments that I'd really like to focus on in the time that I have is the naval exhibit at the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. At that exhibition, the Navy built essentially a fake battleship into Lake Michigan, built of wood, of brick, and of plaster, and they dubbed it the USS Illinois. And it was built from the waterline up to be the exact dimensions of the first class of modern American battleships that were then being built in the United States, the very symbols of American sea power and empire in the years that follow. A little bit of context about the battleship and the Navy in this era, which you may very well know. But 1893 sits sort of in the middle of an ongoing naval revolution in the United States, which begins around 1884, and really is a movement towards a modern fleet based on steel-hulled and steam-driven warships, with the battleship being at the center of this much more muscular role for the Navy and indeed the nation and the world in this era. The problem, though, as far as I can see it as a military historian, is that this history, most of the history that's been written about the new Navy is done from, it favors military and political elites. And so I'm much more interested in how ordinary Americans encountered the Navy. And I should say that when I'm talking about ordinary Americans, especially at the fair, we're of course only talking about, as voluminous as broad as the numbers were, fairgoers, we're still talking about a limited number of people. For example, people of color, and I can speak more about this, were not often visitors to the fair. So there's an important caveat there. A little bit about the 93 exposition itself. Of course, it was a profoundly important and transformational cultural moment in the United States, and many people have written about this. And of course, it had a way of voicing America's imperial pretensions in a really powerful way, right? It of course harkened back to the quadricentennial of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, but then it in a very thinly veiled way, right? It really picked up with the Americans sort of carrying that imperial torch, not only across the continent, right, but then transoceanically as well. It was a fair, as many were, that were designed by the architects Daniel Burnham, who went on to play an important role in creating architecture in Manila, for example, Frederick Law Olmsted, with certain spatial geographies in mind. And so they thought about the ways in which the various exhibits related to one another in a spatial way and created stories and narratives around that. This was also a time of a tremendous focus on consumption and the consumer, as not just a buyer of goods, right, that the new advertising and marketing that is professionalizing in the nation is hawking them, but also consumers of ideas as well. And I would extend that as far as ideas about navalism, about sea power, and about empire. Of course, as I suggested earlier, Chicago, as it sat at the nexus between the East and the West, had all kinds of things to say about the conquest of the continental frontier, the urban metropolis in the West, and its connections then to the Pacific and across the Pacific as well. And of course, there was a tremendous emphasis in these fairs on visual spectacle, of which the battleship was a part. This naval exhibit that was built into the lake mud of the fairgrounds was unprecedented in what the Navy had done. They had never built a fair exhibit like this before, although they were probably borrowing on some ideas from the Royal Navy in some of their exhibits in military fairs in Great Britain. But you can see some of the information about the ship itself, including that it was crewed by 100 seamen and 10 officers and 15 Marines. Some of its guns were real, some of its secondary and tertiary armament, but the big 13-inch guns of the battleship were fake wooden ones. And you can see that it was tremendously popular. An average daily attendance of 20,000 people visiting the ship a day, The highest, the attendance is on Chicago Day at the fair, 67,000 people, and the Navy estimated that about more than 3 million people visited and walked across the decks of this battleship in the course of the fair from May to October 1893. So I want to pull out a few themes that stand out to me about visitors and fairgoers' experience with the battleship. One is technological. Americans were enthralled with this new technology, its size, its grandiosity, its aesthetics. The Navy paid attention to things like a stars and stripes shield on the gilded bow crest of these battleships, the real ones and the fake one, right? Literally, the Navy being the shield of the Republic, right? That message coming through very clearly. Most Americans, at least as far as the press and people who are writing journals that are remarking about this, speak mostly about the impressiveness of the battleship's main guns. These are 13-inch guns in the turrets fore and aft. No naval vessel in the United States had boasted, indeed none in the world at the time, boasted a main armament quite that big. And so these people were really impressed by the destructive power of these guns and many other kinds of technology as well that I don't have time to talk about now. But I really love this image from the Chicago Herald with a bunch of men, right? This encounter with technology was highly masculinized, especially around the guns, as you might imagine. So a bunch of men squatting around one of the 6-inch guns aboard the Illinois, probably talking about the technical aspects, right? And I love the title underneath, right? Assuming that they know all the technical aspects, but also suggesting that they probably think they know more than they actually do, right? The Illinois was also a kind of a theater for naval spectacle and performance, and there are many instances of this, but I want to highlight particularly the electric shows that the ship put on at night, lighting up the fairgrounds and the lakeshore with this impressive electricity show. This was one of the hallmarks of the Chicago Fair, was Westinghouse's alternating current electricity, and the Navy bought into this wholeheartedly. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Taussig, talking about wanting to use electricity, right, to cause weak-eyed visitors to gasp, right? He very much understood that he wanted to use electricity to conjure an emotional response, right, and to impress visitors. The other interesting thing about electricity here is that if the great guns, and this is present in the reporting, if the great guns cast a kind of militaristic impressiveness of the battleship's destructive potential, right, and of American sea power, electricity did something quite different but also complementary. If you look at the rhetoric around this, right, it changed the vessel into a plaything of the American Navy, a fairy-like craft. Another newspaper called it the great governmental toy, right? And so if anybody was sort of impressed but also put off by the threat of the battleship's power as evidenced by its guns, right, electricity had a way of making this a little bit more innocuous, right? It rendered the battleship not threatening so much anymore, but perhaps a toy-like kind of thing that the public could sort of consume in that way. In the innards of the ship, there were spaces that were devoted to the skeleton crew that the Navy posted to the vessel. And those spaces were often ones that at least according to the press, that women fairgoers found to be particularly fascinating, right? They were interested in the galleys and the mess. They were interested in the wardrooms and the berths, places that were domestic spaces in this militarized technology. Right? And at least according to the press, right, and certainly within the gendered conventions of the time, right, women seemed to find spaces aboard the ship, not the guns so much, but those inward spaces, right, that they could relate to, that resonated with them, and that they could sort of understand the battleship in ways that were familiar to the gendered conventions of the time. There was also within the insides of the battleship various exhibits of the Navy, one of which was a model room that showed the technological evolution of the Navy from all the way going back to sail-powered vessels of the Revolution, all the way up to the most modern steel battleships, of which the Illinois purported to be one. And these tended to be particularly exciting for young people who came out to the fair, young children, boys in particular, often clad in their sailor suits, right? Who, right, if the electric shows rendered the battleship as a plaything, right, they're literally inside the ship, were model ships, right, that little hands could, or little minds could sort of grasp, right, and could understand. I want to talk a little bit about the spatial geography of the Illinois relative to other exhibits. One of the things that I find to be most fascinating is that the U.S. Navy actually sent a bunch of officers over to Spain, and they constructed three representations, three reconfigurations of Columbus's caravels, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, and they sailed these caravels across the ocean, or some cases they were towed to New York when they took part in a naval review in New York, and then to Chicago, the natural end of the Columbian voyage, right? And so when visitors saw these vessels, they often put them in contrast and in comparison to one another, so that they'd not only sort of see that here was in the Illinois, the brick battleship, here was a continuation of Spanish naval power in the New World now taken up by the United States, but they also saw discontinuities in that they often judged these small sailing vessels as quaint and antiquated, right, as sort of as decadent as, right, in terms of decay, as the Spanish Empire seemed to be for so many Americans as the United States is sort of rising in its imperial pretensions. There was also a spatial logic, I should say, to the Victoria House, which was Great Britain's house for its commissioners and its dignitaries. Public officials and British dignitaries would come, and the house was situated by the park's the exhibition's organizers right on the waterfront, so that when they walked out, what did they see but a spectacle of American sea power, especially as the United States is now looking up to British sea power and empire, right, as the sort of paragon. This is not to suggest that every encounter that the public had with the Navy at the fair was profound and extraordinary. In fact, and this is reported on in the press quite a bit, one of the problems that many people found is that they were convinced that the battleship was actually real, when in fact it was not. There was a really fun and interesting anecdote of a steam whistle going off aboard the ship. Everybody thought the ship was real, and so everybody decided they didn't want to leave the fair yet. They thought the ship was going to steam away. And so they all flooded to the gangway to try to get back to land. They trampled each other. A woman fell overboard into the water. She hurt her ankle. The naval architect who designed the Illinois was in the water himself. He said in the press he regretted designing the ship to look so real. But in a time, right, when Americans are being confronted with these consumer ideas, right, and trying to be sold goods and ideas, they walk away from the ship thinking that maybe they had been sold something that they didn't quite understand, right? When this line between authenticity and artifice is very ambiguous in the late 19th century. And so some of these appeals that the Navy was trying to argue, they didn't always go over so well. I could say much more, but I would really like to just highlight that I think this story of the brick battleship, which may seem sort of tangential, is actually quite important, I think. It's a very important cultural moment. And I think it ties to a lot of other encounters that the American public has with navalism in this era. Certainly the Spanish-American War is an important one. But if I can get this video to play. But I want to
From the Library of Congress.
There it is. Yeah. I want to suggest that Americans' encounter with the battleship Maine, which of course we all know is an important part of the story, not so much in the destruction of the ship itself, but in the ways in which it's commemorated in the years after the Spanish-American War. You see the Bangor, Maine Memorial up there, that you see that bow crest, the shield that I was talking about. There are more than 1,500 Maine monuments and memorials of actual pieces of the Maine that were taken from the salvaged ship and given to towns and cities across the United States, literally reconstituting the wreck of the ship in a national scope, and having Americans on a local level be able to participate in the rituals of mourning and memorialization, I think was a really important part of this process. I could say a lot more about that, but I won't. I think the logical outcome of this is the cruise of the Great White Fleet, the U.S. Atlantic Battleship Fleet, between 1907 and 1909, and particularly its ports of call on the West Coast, from San Diego to San Francisco and Seattle. at a time, right, when these cities, local boosters of these cities are advocating for more military investment, right, major naval bases as the United States is looking into the Pacific, millions of people come out in these spectacles to go aboard ships, to learn more about the technology, to interact with sailors and with officers. These are really important encounters. And now going aboard real battleships, right, in 1908 rather than fake battleships in 1893. So navalism is performative, it is theatrical, it invites ordinary Americans to come in and to participate in this, and I think the stakes are quite high, because when it comes to empire, right, I think many Americans having this relationship with the U.S. Navy, playing into the pomp and circumstance of navalism, right, are able to really hold on to that version of empire, right, and just as it obscures, right, the violence and the contradictions that are at heart, you know, the American imperial project in acquiring these places and then administering them in those years. Thank you.
All right, first off, thank you everyone for being here, and I think I may be the only person who has to say this. What I'm about to say are my own views and do not reflect those of the Naval War College and the Department of Defense. So, no, this is a real thing I have to do, so, so I'm glad I got that out of the way. So, so today what I want to talk about are essentially the narratives that come out of 1898, and essentially there's two narratives that I really want to focus on. One is the story the Navy likes to tell about itself, and that is essentially a very positive story. And then the story of essentially power and exploitation that the Navy often chooses to forget about itself that accompanies this rise to power. So, without further ado. So the privilege story starts with the intellectual and cultural transformation of the Navy and the development of American sea power, and it's really driven by several officers, but in particular Stephen B. Luce, who's on the left, and Alfred Thayer Mahan on the right. Both of them are key figures in getting Americans to think about sea power as an element of national strategy. Both of them are also important figures in pushing the Navy to professionalize. And both of them are also important in making the political and public case to build a new Navy at a time in which the American Navy is relatively small compared to those of many foreign powers. So, in the wake of the 1898 wars, you know, one thing that really stands out for the Navy and for many in the United States is for the imperial project, you know, Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines are important, and the U.S. is obviously happy to be possessing them from a strategic standpoint. But what's really driving a lot of American political choices in the years afterwards is China. And this is a point that if you got to do the gallery talk yesterday with Theodore Gonzalez, was really fantastic. But he points out just the centrality to China and the open door and the American commitment to opening up Chinese markets to all Western powers equally. You know, obviously this doesn't really take into account what the Chinese thought of this. So, but what this does is by making the United States a Pacific power, it forces the Navy to have to think about what kind of conflict may they be fighting against other foreign powers. And so here's a map that shows the way in which war planners starting in the early 1900s started to color code war plans. So you can see Germany was black, Britain is red, and Japan is colored orange. And so in particular, the plan against Japan, War Plan Orange, is going to occupy a lot of mental space for the next 4 decades. How do you fight a war in the Pacific against the other rising Pacific power? In particular, the Japanese, who also have their own designs on China, and as the Americans believe, would like to take the Philippines away from us to prevent us from accessing China. So here you get a sense of what that, a very crude representation of what that war may look like. The United States having to move its fleet into the Pacific, traverse the Pacific, and then fight the Imperial Japanese Navy somewhere around the Philippines, relieve the Philippines, and then isolate the Japanese home islands using a naval blockade. So this is a pretty significant problem. There's thousands of miles of ocean, only limited numbers of bases in between. And so this is a very complex problem that the Navy spends a lot of time trying to solve. The Navy is going to have to reorganize itself in order to do this kind of conflict. For most of the 19th century, the Navy is deployed around the world in small squadrons. These are designed to enforce American political commitments, to protect American commerce. They are not there to fight any kind of major battle against a foreign power. So, so the fleet is very very widely scattered. But this is going to start to change, starting just prior to the Spanish-American War, but then in the years afterwards. And so, as Jason just mentioned, the symbol of this is the Great White Fleet, so the North Atlantic Fleet, as it travels around the world, 1907, 1909, commanded for a time by Fighting Bob Evans, who, if you've seen the metal fan on display in the exhibit, it's one of the neatest things upstairs. He's the first commander of the fleet. He ends up getting sick and has to leave in San Francisco. And so this is a symbol of American naval growth and expansion. After World War I, though, the calculus changes. The public really turns its back, in some ways, on sea power. And the reason why is many in the public, both in the United States and around the world, view sea power as a key cause of World War I. And so at the Washington Conference in 1921, 1922, there's a series of treaties signed that essentially put naval arms limitations on all the key foreign powers. And then there's also other agreements signed that essentially demilitarize the Pacific, and so prevents foreign powers from building new bases and fortifying them in the Pacific. So, for the U.S. Navy, again, thinking about this from their own internal logic, this has just made their problem a whole lot harder. On top of all of this, after World War I, the Japanese have been granted mandates, basically legalized colonialism, sponsored by the League of Nations, over the former German-held islands in the Central Pacific. And so for the Navy now, not only are they already worried about having to fight the Japanese for one reason or another, now there are Japanese islands between Hawaii and the Philippines, and Guam is now surrounded by enemy possessions. And so this makes the idea of enforcing these American policies in the Pacific that much more difficult. The fleet, as I said, has now mostly returned to home waters. And so, again, the fleet's going to have to move from the west coast of the United States across the Pacific. We'll talk about the Asiatic fleet here in a minute. One of my personal favorite items on display in the exhibit upstairs is the naval war game. And so this was designed as essentially a tool to sell to the public how you might use sea power to accomplish American objectives in Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines in the 1898 conflicts. And so it's a very crude public game, but it's similar in some ways to games that the Navy will play itself. This is at the Naval War. This is a war game played at the Naval War College. In fact, this building or this space is just right down the hall from my office. And so the Navy is going to spend a lot of time. Officers are going to be doing games in Newport for decades, trying to figure out how do you move a fleet from one side of the Pacific to another. And so, as I mentioned, this is a much more complex problem in the 1930s, especially now that there are aircraft, and the Japanese have all these islands. And so, again, here's a later version of what they think a war against Japan may look like. And so, as a result of all of this, the Navy essentially changes the way it's going to fight conflicts. Starts to build aircraft carriers. You know, and this gives you some idea of how many aircraft you can put on a deck to launch at once. Yeah, I had a student try to count this. I think he lost count at some point. Come on. The Marines are going to be transformed from a service which had been doing a lot of enforcement of dollar diplomacy missions in Latin America in the early 19th century into a force that is designed to seize enemy-held islands and turn them into bases. So the solution that the Navy comes up with is if you can't build a base in the Philippines for political or economic reasons, or in Guam for the same reasons, you will just take your base with you. Build the ships to take with you across the Pacific. So here's a an image taken of Ulithi Atoll. This is in the Paula Islands. And these are the atoll is seized in late 1944 and becomes the major advanced fleet base in the South Pacific for the remainder of the conflict. And as you can see, the Navy has essentially turned the island into just one massive base. And they do this in a matter of weeks. So the island was relatively undefended, and in a few weeks, Navy engineers and new ships have shown up and turned the island into a base. And so you can now take the implements that you need to repair ships with you across the Pacific and send them back into harm's way in relatively short notice. You don't have to send them all the way back to the United States. And so these are the some of the ingredients that the Navy will use to fight the war in the Pacific against the Japanese in the 1940s and steam its way to victory in Tokyo Bay in 1945. So, as I said, this is the story the Navy likes to tell about itself. However, as this kind of transformative project is going on in the U.S. Navy, there's the Asiatic Fleet, and so it's very much a remnant of the 19th century. It's the only part of the Navy that is deployed outside of the Western Hemisphere on a permanent basis, and it looks very much like an old 19th century squadron. It's designed to protect American commerce, enforce American political commitments. It's not there to fight a war, even though it's the fleet by far the closest to the Japanese. And so it's going to be based in the Philippines, but ships from the Asiatic Fleet will also be in China and other parts of East Asia. Here's a picture of some of the ships of the Asiatic Fleet in Hong Kong in 1910, berthed alongside British and French warships, and this is a fairly common occurrence for various Western powers to have all of their ships together, and for there to be a lot of collaboration between the ships themselves as they're all enforcing their various imperial projects overseas. And so, as part of this, there's a certain set of stereotypes and cultural projections that come out of the long-term presence of the Asiatic Fleet in East Asia. For many sailors, they enjoy service in China, not the least of which because their money goes farther. They're able to build off of these systems of exploitation. Their money goes a whole lot farther. They can afford servants in China that they cannot afford at home. And so for a well-paid or for a poorly paid enlisted sailor, this is a not insignificant matter. Here's a collection of pictures that were collected in a scrapbook in the 1920s that's held by the Navy History and Heritage Command. And so it gives you an idea of what sorts of things sailors were remembering, what they were transmitting about their experience in East Asia. So you've got some of their favorite watering holes. You've got pictures of foreign women. But up here, you've got a picture of a tailless monkey from the Philippines, but also the representation of a semi-nude Filipino woman. So this gives you an insight into the ways in which, you know, what sorts of things are they paying attention to? What sorts of things are they transmitting between themselves regarding their service in China? Some of this is done on the individual level, but some of this is also done at the institutional level. The Navy is more than willing to advertise service in China as a means of luring new recruits into the service. This is a recruiting poster from the 1920s. The Navy by this point has retired its old slogan, "Join the Navy and see the world," but they're still more than willing to recruit based off of some of those old tropes and ideas. Here's a cartoon that was drawn by a sailor in the Asiatic Fleet in the 1930s. I won't try to read all of the text in the center. I encourage you to do so at your own, but there's some pretty vile things said in there. But if nothing else, it does indicate that for many sailors in China, some were fascinated by their service in Asia. Others were completely repulsed by it. And so at least down here you can see, a couple of sailors singing a song about their very strong desire to return back to the United States. But this is, again, representative of just the very conflicted, very dichotomous nature of how Americans viewed their service in East Asia. Accompanying this at times were popular cultural narratives. This is the film Men Without Women. It's a very early John Ford movie, released in 1930, set aboard a submarine. John Ford, as we all know, is famous for The Searchers and other films later on. This is one of his early efforts. The first 15 minutes of this film, though, are set in Shanghai, and perpetuates a lot of the cultural stereotypes that you see frequently in the period. So showing a bar frequented by a lot of foreigners, but also with a lot of hostesses and sex workers. And then on their way back to the submarine, the crew wanders their way through the red light district in Shanghai and has an encounter with a sex worker who is sitting in a cage. What's fascinating to me about this film is the fact that it is a pre-code picture. There's a lot of material in these first 15 minutes of the film that one would not have been able to get away with just a few years later. But what's also interesting about this movie is the fact that this did receive some cooperation from the U.S. Navy in its production. In the years after World War II, the Navy will return to the Philippines, and so even though the Philippines has now been granted its independence by the United States, the U.S. is going to dramatically build up its base in Subic Bay, and it's going to be the primary point of projection of American power into East Asia, and in particular during America's war in Vietnam. And so again, even though the Philippines has achieved this independence, the American presence will grow and expand. And what's really interesting about this post-war period, the Navy in particular had worked with local officials in the United States in the years leading up to World War II to clean up red light districts around the country. And so well-known red light districts like the Tenderloin in Manhattan, the Stingaree in San Diego are all going to be closed down, at least in part, because of Navy cooperation. On the other hand, the places like Olongapo and then Angeles, which is the town just outside of Clark Air Base, also in the Philippines, are going to be essentially unofficially tolerated for their sex work. And so as this has been criminalized in the United States, it is still going to be tolerated on an institutional level by the U.S. Navy. And so, all the way up through 1991, there's an estimated, I saw one sociological study that said there were probably 55,000 sex workers between Olongapo and Angeles at one point. And I know for a fact that there are a number of rituals, sexual rituals, that are going to be passed from sailor to sailor and ship to ship over these decades. And so just very quickly in closing, so the U.S. Leaves Subic Bay in 1992. A new lease agreement is not agreed upon, and so the U.S. Navy, for the most part, is absent from the Philippines for the next few decades. But as the recent tensions between all the various powers in Southeast Asia have flared up, in particular because of Chinese encroachments into the South China Sea, and now the Philippines has their own direct dispute with China, the United States has been invited back. And so, the question that I ask as as a military historian who's, but also one interested in culture is, I do wonder how will the U.S. presence in the Philippines and in Subic Bay in particular be different this time around. And so with that, thank you.
The moment of drama when you find out if the microphone works. And whether the gentleman in the back throws something at me. Yep, he's throwing something at me. First off, thank you very much for the presentations. I think it was quite an amazingly broad spectrum of things. I think we're reasonably constrained for time. Kate is looking at me sadly. So what I'd like to do is ask maybe one or two questions of the panelists, and then give time to the audience to also ask a question or two, if that's workable. The thing I wanted to start off with, and this is for all four of you, is I think one of the themes of the conference and of the panel is the story untold, the history untold, the things that get left out of the histories that we pay attention to, whether it's because we're following the political and economic elites, the racial elites. And the question I wanted to ask out of this is, how do you see going about and recovering the stories that are left out? So there's really sort of two parts to that, which is what's left out of the stories that you're working on, and how do you think about recovering those voices and those histories? And anybody who wants to address that is great.
Well, I can say that just in my own engagement with this project, and as a result of the perspectives that other presentations have brought to this left out history, it's made me very conscious of my lack of engagement with records from the perspective of Indian scouts and certainly in the Philippines. So I can excuse part of that, I guess, by saying early project, but I think it's also it's a form of training. It's a form of cultural and American imperial approach to the archives and to the story as well. I've been thinking about that a lot here.
Jason, you want to?
Better? Yeah. I mean, it's really the historian's dilemma, you know. There's just so much that we don't know, so much we can never know, right? You know, I as you can probably tell, I've used a lot of newspaper reporting, which itself is problematic, right? And any effort to get at sort of military encounters from memoirs or journals, diaries is useful, but not a lot of them seem to exist. I've found it very difficult to search through archives to find whether any particular fairgoer talked about the brick battleship or not, for example. You can benefit from digitization of these sources, but in a lot of ways, a lot of places, you still have to go to them. And so I think, you know, if you're going to do a traditional military history, you go to National Archives or Library of Congress, and all the institutional records are there, and it's wonderful in a lot of ways. But it's also, of course, it is also very problematic. But just the practical logistics of seeing these records all over the place where they do exist is hard.
Well, I was cut short, so I'll talk about what I left out. Part of what Federico did was filibustering, and we were fortunate that we were able to get information about the Cuban side of the filibustering. And I was also fortunate to talk to Luis Pérez from Chapel Hill. He talked to me about an archive that had not been seen before in the National Archives. So we were able to contrast the U.S. presence and the U.S. military issues with the Cuban issues. again, a story not told, because these are secondary figures. So it's sort of easy, I guess, for us as historians to look at the great battles and the great persons like Maceo and others, because if you want to write a book and get it published, well, that's probably the easy way. The harder way, I think, is to go to the other side and look at the secondary figures. But in a way that I think is the more interesting part of the history, because it gives you a lot of details that you will not find another way.
Let me, thank you. Let me follow up with my second question, and this is in different ways came out of all of your presentations. One of the things that struck me was that I think yesterday and in other presentations that they were talking about the use of savagery as a way of distancing non-white peoples and colonial subjects from Americans and from the imperial project. What came through to me in a number of your presentations was the fascination with savagery, with the idea that scouting is this return to a fundamental love of the wilderness. The sort of fascination in the movie picture that you showed, Ryan, the way in which it's not always a distancing, the labeling is not always a distancing thing, but something that's also seductive. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that sort of complicated relationship in the 30 seconds you have left. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. So, yeah, there is this struggle that, I think as the Navy and its sailors, which technically can sometimes be two separate things, we'll try to craft these disparate narratives, and what's really fascinating for me is the Navy will sometimes lean into some of the rhetoric of imperialism, even as you can see there is this oftentimes this very dispassionate very policy making tone that they will do this. And so it's interesting to watch them. They will kind of set up some of these tropes, but then they will try to distance themselves from the things that they are distancing themselves from. And it feels like you're at about 3 levels removed from this. But then you get reminded, with some of the various projects that I've done, that when you get down to narratives, stereotypes, images that are being created on an individual level, like some of the pictures that I showed. They are not trying to distance themselves, and so it's interesting to see just the various levels of remove that you can get depending on who is producing the image, who's producing the narrative.
And I'll just comment quickly that the other thing that's very interesting that's going on in this moment at the end of the 19th century, which again I think you set up well for us, David, is the emergence of what are called civilian scouting movements, right? It's the birth and the re-territorialization over here of the Boy Scout movement that comes out of the military scouting movements, if you want to follow certain interpretations. And this is a fascinating coalescence and complication of these ideas of savagery and civilization that Philip Deloria has explored in his book, Playing Indian, and the author Hundorf, whose first name I can't remember, in this book called Going Native. So there's a literature on this and a more recent one as well. And, it also has to be informed by the development of ethnology as a science and Edward Tyler's ideas about culture. And so I think in here, we all tend to broadly schematize this as one thing. But then, of course, in the practice of scouting, which is not just an ideology and a projection, but also working out on the ground of some, life and death kinds of situations, those projections, I think, break down a lot in the individual experience of people on both sides of the kind of divide that we're setting up here is a racial one.
Kate, do we have time for questions from the audience? Somebody have a question from the audience? Use it wisely.
I have a question.
Yes.
I have a question, yes. Thank you all for your presentations. And I think, well, my question is something I learned a lot by doing the show with Kate, right? And I didn't know anything about the Navy. And one thing that I found really fascinating was, well, this notion of the Great White Fleet. And just in the context of, Jason, your discussion of the aesthetics of the Navy, I wondered if that was an aesthetic choice. Also, if, this custom of painting the ships white before they go to battle, I'm amazed at the labor that might take, just like thousands of workers, I'm imagining, working very quickly. So if you could elaborate a little bit on that, I'd be very grateful.
The Navy, they spend a lot of time painting and repainting their ships. I've looked in vain to try to find some sort of general order that said we're going to paint the hulls of our ships white for a particular reason, and I don't want to make too much of the whiteness, but at the same time, I think there is something going on, and certainly there's a connection between the whiteness of the ship, the fake ship, and the whiteness of the White City, right, which Frederick Douglass called a white sepulcher. There is good scholarship out there on the ways in which naval heroes from 1898, Dewey in particular, are used to sell products such as soap, and so sanitization and cleanliness are associated with naval heroes and whiteness in, I think, various ways. I'd answer that question.
Folks, I believe we're out of time. Thank you very much for your attention. We really appreciate it. Thanks, folks, for doing it. Thank you to the timekeeper. We have lunch now, and then we're gathering back here at 1 o'clock. Oh, if anybody wants to continue asking questions, we'll hang out for a little bit.